And our second panel will now tackle the huge challenge of inequality, for many the cancer in our society. And it will be moderated by Liz Alderman, the Chief European Business Correspondent of the New York Times that is based in Paris, and someone that has covered the crisis here in Greece very closely. I also call our panelists to join a man that needs no introduction, especially in Greece, is Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Princeton professor, and New York Times columnist, based in the US. Anna Diamantopoulou, former EU Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs, former Minister for Education in Greece, and now President of the Greek think tank DIKTIO. And Alan Rousso, Managing Director for External Relations and Partnerships for the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development based in London. Liz, over to you.
Well, thanks, Achilles, and thank you all for being here. It's pretty hard to top the panel that we just had, but it was interesting that it ended on this question about, basically, if you have more money, do you have more freedom of speech, which leads into the topic of this panel, which is one of the most important here today, and that is on the issue of income inequality. As Achilles said, I've been covering the European crisis now for several years, and I've seen firsthand in a number of countries here, from Ireland to Spain, and indeed specifically here in Greece, how quickly income inequality has grown and what the consequences of that are, both on a political and social level. And indeed, the widening gap between the very rich and everyone else here in Europe, as well as the uneven nature of the recovery in the United States, is forcing policymakers and millions of ordinary people to confront this challenge as never before. So today we are going to talk about inequality, why that gap is getting wider, what does it mean for democracy when the rich have more influence than the majority of the people, and what can really be done to address it. Obviously, this is a topic that warrants an almost endless discussion, but we have limited time today to tackle really some of the toughest themes with a very distinguished panel. So let me just jump right into it right away. Paul Krugman, you are an op-ed columnist for the Times, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and obviously this is an issue that you have written about extensively in our pages. Despite all of the talk about narrowing income inequality, why does it still seem to be getting wider around the world? And will things get worse before they get better?
Okay, so I think the first answer has to be, actually, we don't know. I think that, and that's kind of important. Maybe I should invoke Socrates here and say knowing that you don't know is very important here. We had a narrative that was very popular. You still see people rolling it out, which says, oh, it's all because technology has increased the demand for highly skilled workers, and it's all about education. And what we now do know is that that narrative doesn't work. That it's not a story about college graduates doing well, because in fact, the average college graduate in the US has seen no gain in real income since 2000. It's not about the top 20% pulling away, as people still sometimes write. It is about the top 1%, the top 0.1% pulling away from everyone else. Hard to explain what the underlying forces are there, but there's a lot of reason to think that it is about institutions, that it's about power, that it's about politics, and if that's what worries you, then there are good reasons to think that unless there's a major change in policy of some kind, and which is hard to achieve, it's going to continue over time. That we have not seen this widening inequality reach its limit by a long shot. For one thing, one sees the political influence of people at the top, which seems to feed on itself. Think about the fact that, of course, Donald Trump is the leading Republican in the polls, but the choice of the establishment, who might still get the nomination, and certainly has a $100 million war chest, is Jeb Bush, and his great policy proposal is, given everything, what do we really need to do? And the answer is very large tax cuts on top incomes and on capital income. That tells you something, that he felt that was what he needed to do to jumpstart his campaign. And then there is the issue, the very old-fashioned issue, but it's come back, which is that of accumulated wealth, inheritance, what Thomas Piketty in the book that everyone should have read, everyone bought, but very few people actually read. But anyway, the rise of patrimonial capitalism. We are increasingly becoming not just a society of extreme inequality, but a society where much of that inequality is inherited, and that will feed on itself over time as well. So this is if you try to think about where we may be going over the next 20 years, it's a frightening moment, even though we don't fully understand what's going on, but it looks like it's continuing to happen.
Anna Diamantopoulou, sorry. You're the president of the Greek think tank DIKTIO, and also as the former European Commissioner for Employment and Social Affairs, you have a pretty unique perspective on this situation. I mean, is the reason for the wealth divide only economic, or are politicians and bad policies to blame?
Okay, thank you for this invitation and for this very interesting panel and discussion. Of course, there is not a simple answer to this question. And of course, it is not only economy. I could say that this discussion would have a distinction. It is inequality between countries, and it's inequality within societies. And it is totally, not totally, but there is a big difference in this discussion. If we come to the inequalities within countries, and we can see the situation in the European Union during the crisis, particularly in Greece, when we have the crisis and at the same time a growing inequality. I think we could focus on two main issues. The first one is the financialization of the economy, which started in the 80s. And it changed the nature of economy around the world and in Europe and in Greece, of course. And then it is the institutions, and it has to do with democracy, it has with the health of institutions in different countries and how they do work and how they deliver, and the reforms needed. So, to make this long story short, I think that as far as the European Union is concerned, that according to your question, we need a strong reform in the European institutions. And to my point, it needs more Europe, and it needs changes in the European economic institutions. It needs a European budget to transfer, for fiscal transfers and redistribution, because this is one of the major issues in the European Union. And as far as institutions is concerned, I'm coming to Greece, and there is a need of deep reforms for better and healthier institutions. And here is one of my disagreement with what Paul has said for Greece for months now, that there is a need of change in the currency and the monetary union and the monetary policy, etc. And here I have just to say and finish with that in Greece, austerity is not the only problem and is not the only solution. The main issue is the reforms in institutions, because there is no possibility for a transition to another currency, to transition to Europe with this political system, with these institutions, and with this culture.
We'll definitely get back to Paul on that in a second, but Alan, you're the managing director at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. First of all, I mean, are just changing and strengthening institutions enough, really, to address a widening income and wealth gap and inequality gap in many of these countries? And, you know, what also, you've done a lot of studies on whether the extent to which the middle class in certain countries actually having a large middle class rather than a stark divide between the wealthy and poor provides an actual bulwark to democracy. What is your view on this?
Thanks, Liz. First, let me just say that EBRD was created in 1991, so soon after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, in an environment in which all countries that we worked in were equal. All people within those countries were sharing an equal level of misery in a way. And we were created to help them move toward a different system through a process of creative destruction that created huge inequality, but also helped to create the foundations for democracy. So the relationship between democracy and inequality, at least in the emerging democracies, is a complicated one. I think it was expected that over time, the inequalities that we helped to create, if I'm honest, that they would sort of smooth out in a kind of, Simon Kuznets sort of way. There would be this curve where initial inequalities would eventually give rise to more even distribution of the benefits of the transition to a market system. And in some cases that worked. And it worked mostly in the cases where countries were more democratic, where they embraced the institutions of good governance and democracy. Where it seemed to fail is where that initial wealth accumulation in places like Russia and the former Soviet Union led to the creation of this class of what we now refer to as oligarchs. And a very unequal system, a very uneven distribution of the benefits of transition to markets and to democracy. And then they froze that system in place. And they created institutions that were highly imperfect and very difficult to dislodge, because there was a strong sort of connection between those people with a lot of money and the people in power. And so this oligarchic class essentially pulled up the drawbridge on transition and said, transition was great, it helped us to get rich, and now we want to stop the process. So I think there is a relationship here between inequality and democracy over time. I do think that institutions in places in Central Europe, for example, those that are members now of the European Union, have embraced good institutions, and those good institutions have helped to deliver the goods, which is why people keep going out and reinforcing them. So I think ultimately, yes, to get to your question about the middle class, does that help the process? I think the creation of a middle class in Central Europe and all the new EU member states from the region that we work in, it certainly is a bulwark, a reinforcement of democracy. As Aristotle said in the 4th century, the best community is one that is formed of the middle class. But it has to be of a certain size to have that impact. And what we've seen in some parts of our region, the former Soviet Union, and now the region we work in the southern and eastern Mediterranean region, the middle class is simply too small to have that impact. So I think there does have to be a certain threshold where the middle class can have that impact. And the one exception to all of this, of course, is Russia, where you have a large middle class, but a middle class that doesn't seem to be doing the job of a middle class that we've seen in a lot of other countries, and we can talk further about that.
Paul, why don't you talk about the middle class and whether the middle class in the United States?
Actually, can I go in a slightly different direction? Because I'd like to talk, because I think, let me start. When the financial crisis hit, many people expected a replay of the New Deal story, or the equivalent, which took place in a number of European countries, where in response to crisis, the evident failure of unregulated capitalism, that you would have a return to institutions that promoted a middle class, if you like, that we'd see a turn away from worship of the market, we'd see a movement towards greater equality. And by and large, it has not turned out that way. Although actually in the United States, even though Barack Obama has not turned out to be FDR, he's turned out to, in the end, he's been more of FDR than people imagine. In fact, tax rates at the top are up substantially. In fact, we have a vaguely universal healthcare system, so we've made some direction. But in Europe, things have clearly gone in the opposite direction. The effect of policy has been strongly unequalizing. Europe has become more extremes. It has workers, the middle class, such as it is, has been disempowered, not empowered. That has a lot to do. It's fundamentally tied to currency fears, to austerity, and what's happened is that the fears of another economic crisis, anxiety over debt, have been used as hammers with which to smash. Instead of building institutions that will limit inequality, it has been used as a hammer with which to smash the institutions that have in the past provided some bulwark against extreme inequality. Interestingly, it has been an enormously undemocratic process. The complete European policy is determined by technocrats at the center, except we have this funny thing, which somewhat bears on the previous panel. Democracy is bad because the public doesn't know what to do. Instead, we have technocrats who it also turns out have absolutely no idea what to do, except that the one consistent theme is that we're going to, again, we're going to smash the power of workers. We're going to disempower the working class. We've seen a collapse of the center left in Europe because it is complicit in these policies. You want to ask how it is that Corbyn can be the new leader of the Labour Party. I don't think that's a sudden, drastic leftward shift of Labour voters. It's the fact that everyone else has, that they might have supported is endorsing the same failed, allegedly technocratic policies. Now, of course, that's happening in the UK, which is not on the euro, but I think the euro, unfortunately, has made it even worse. It has left Greece with essentially no power as long as it's on the currency. There's an agonizing problem now, which is, is there any way to buck this trend without departing the euro? Is there any way to depart the euro without an economic catastrophe? It's all turned into an enormous trap. But I think we need to understand that there has been a fundamental undemocratic de-democratization in Europe, which is in fact contributing very much to increasing inequality.
Anna, you probably would agree with that.
Yes and no, but it is true that Europe cannot continue like that, and Eurozone cannot continue like that, because we live in this strange situation that we have a currency without a state. We have a currency without an economic policy. And we have seen the consequences during the crisis regarding the inequality issue. Just to give you an idea, during the crisis, 15 out of 28 countries of the European Union had a decrease in the educational budget. In some countries, particularly in Greece, this decreasing in the educational budget was 35%. So taking into account the correlation between education and growth and distribution of growth, we can understand what the consequences will be in a few years concerning the gap between the Greek society or between between Greece and other countries, or these 10 European countries who had a decreasing in the educational budget. So we live in an era that we understand very well that in Europe cannot continue like this, and this is why I said that there is a need of decisions. We discussed about the refugee issue, and yesterday there was no decision in the European Council. So in order to see Europe to move forward again and to give the example of democracy and of new institutions, I think first we need a big, deep change in the institutions of economy, taxation in the European Union, taxation policy. It's really a mess. The distribution issue, as I told, the budget, and common policy in defense, on military issues, and in Europol. Maybe we think that it has nothing to do with inequality, but I think it's interesting to underline the fact that this discussion about inequality in societies is a total different issue when in our neighbor countries there is war, or in a domestic, at a domestic level there is no peace. So it is peace, democracy, and equality. And just to give you another example about equality and democracy, what kind of democracy functions in Greece during the crisis when there were 248 different bills in 18 months? I mean, it is not a democratic functioning of the parliament. The members of the parliament do not understand what they vote for, and of course people do not participate at all in the consultation. So yes, it is a very difficult moment for Europe. I agree with Paul that the collapse of the center left has to do with that there is no alternative. For the time being, it is what I said in the beginning, financialization of the economy, and how we work in that with no new, fresh ideas how to change it.
May I come in on this this question about de-democratization, which Paul mentioned? I mean, we know from looking at studies that have evidence from past 200 years or so that it's very rare, if not unheard of, for countries, once they reach a certain threshold, a certain level of economic development, to reverse course and become non-democracies. So I think when we talk about sort of democracy being in crisis, I think we should be careful about what we mean about the nature of that crisis. I don't see established democracies in developed countries becoming non-democracies. And in fact, in the region where we work, I don't really see those countries which are still in transition, in Southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, and the Baltic states, those countries suddenly throwing democracy overboard because it's not working, because it faces challenges. So I think there are challenges to democracy, to the way the system functions, and it doesn't always function perfectly, to go back to the discussion of the previous panel. But I think it functions well enough that people have the urge to keep it going. It may mean that parties rise and fall. It may mean that people are out in the streets, but they still prefer a democratic way of solving problems to a non-democratic way of solving problems. So I, for one, don't feel quite as nervous that democracy is about to be reversed fundamentally and replaced with a different system of governance in the countries that we're talking about, certainly not in Europe. In other parts of the region where EBRD works, I do think there are risks, that democracy is still has not taken firm hold in many of those places. And there are strong anti-democratic sentiments expressed by people which may ultimately prevail. I think the purpose of institutions like ours is to try to sort of work against that by creating this entrepreneurial class, by creating a middle class, which ultimately will push harder and harder to ensure that there are institutions that protect everyone, that there is a level playing field for the economy, but also for politics. And so I just wanted to make that one point about the importance of describing the nature of the crisis that democracy may face in countries where inequality is a serious issue.
If I can weigh in, I think, yes, the odds of seeing any major democratic nation declare itself no longer a democracy are quite low. The chances of it ceasing to be in practice a democracy are very different. And there are levels and levels. So never mind one-party rule. I think what I'm much more concerned about, and is to an important extent has already happened, is a situation in which, in fact, a fairly small oligarchy gets to define what are the parameters of acceptable discussion, what are the policies that are on the table, what is considered to be respectable and responsible. Thomas Piketty, actually, I found the most interesting thing in the book was he has a discussion of Belle Epoque France, which was democratic in form, democratic in ideology, and in practice very much dominated by not simply a small number of wealthy people, but a small number of people of inherited wealth. Is it really that hard to see that happening? And you can see that happening in the policy debates we have right now. We have some evidence, a wonderful work by my former colleague Larry Bartels, which attempted to find out what are the policy preferences of the truly rich in America, not the top quintile, but the truly rich, and where are the policy differences greatest from those of the general public. And it turns out that the truly rich are vastly more concerned about budget deficits than the ordinary citizen. They are eager to see major social insurance programs cut, whereas the general public wants to see them expanded. Whose views seem to actually prevail? Not only prevail in actual policy, but are the ones that are almost universally reported by the news media as the only sound discussion. And the answer is very clear. So it's not, yes, we will not see. Somebody yesterday said that if a country has democratic in its name, that's a very bad sign, right? So saying that you're a democracy is not the important thing. The question is, how do you actually function? And Europe has become a society of countries that are all democratic in form. And look, there are some real things that matter. They are not, the secret police do not grab you if you say inequality is a problem. But they are increasingly undemocratic in terms of how they are actually run.
Well, talk a little bit more. You actually opened up mentioning the name of Donald Trump here. And since we're talking about, the voice that the 1% or the fraction of the 1%, have, and how that outweighs everybody else, just go into a description of, how that's actually functioning right now in the States.
Well, actually, Trumpism is interesting because part of the secret of his success, aside from tonsure, is that alone among the Republican candidates, he's been willing to say things on the economic issues that reflect what the Republican base believes as opposed to what the donor class believes. That he is in fact calling for higher taxes on top incomes and opposes cutting Social Security. So he's filling what has been an empty box in the political landscape. He is in fact in important ways to the left of the rest of the Republican field, and what's interesting is why. Because he's self-financing. He does not have to have the support of the people who gave Jeb Bush all that money. But I think clearly what we're seeing is now, yes, money-dominated politics. I thought that Piketty was actually right that the Belle Epoque in France is in many ways a better guide to who we are now than the Gilded Age in the U.S. But there was the famous Republican operative Mark Hanna back in the late 19th century who said there are two things that matter in politics. One of them is money, and I can't remember what the other one was. And that is a world. But and then you have to think about. I'm a little scattershot here. In Britain, very important. When you have a situation where what was in my column in yesterday's paper, but the British news media, amazingly, consistently, with almost no contrary voices, have reported as facts allegations about the state of the British economy, the state of British debt, the history of British economic policy, which are simply wrong, easily just refuted, just not true. It's not what happened, but are very, very helpful to a certain side of the political debate. Surely the question of who owns those media outlets has to be an important part of it. And so, now Trump, I'm horrified at the thought of, as a Times columnist, I can't do endorsements, so you actually don't know which party I prefer, but sure, horrible. But we have to recognize that the craziness of the policies and the role of a very rich person in warping the discourse is not by any means a solely Donald Trump phenomenon.
So we want to open it up to the audience for questions, so please raise your hand. But before I do, just getting back to the economic issues of inequality. In the United States, we've seen that the recovery has been happening in an uneven way. Here in Europe, the recovery has basically taken place in a divided Europe, between the North and the South, with the South obviously recovering much more slowly. And here in Greece, to use a concrete example, so many people have basically fallen to the margins of poverty. And there was a great editorial cartoon by Mr. Chapat of a woman standing on a sidewalk with the caption saying, upward mobility does exist. And she says, yeah, I moved from unemployment to the working poor. Are the European and American economies, for example, going to be able to evolve quickly enough to actually address this gap in a meaningful way anytime soon, and to basically give more voices to those people?
I think that it is very interesting what the most recent report of IMF, where it proves with very concrete data that when there is an increasing of the income share of the middle class and the lower class, there is a direct impact in the increasing of growth. When there is an increase in the income share of the 20% of the richer people, there is exactly the opposite. There is a decrease in the growth. So this is, I think, exactly what happened in the South, particularly in Greece. During the crisis, I give you again a very interesting number. There was an increase in the tax property 1,000.7% in the rich people, and there was 1,400% to the poor people. So the impact and the increase of the differences between between the middle class, which almost does not exist, and the richest was really very high during the crisis. So one of the major issues that we have to deal with in Europe is how to change policies. And the whole discussion is about the deficit and the debt, which is very important, and healthy fiscal policy is something very important. But the need now is to focus on the changes in economic issues in all South, because the same, more or less the same problems are in Spain, in Portugal, and in Italy, and now in France. And how to boost growth, because this is the main issue. There is a starting point with the Juncker's new big project concerning growth. EBRD can play a very important role, particularly in countries like Greece. And I think that the $1 million answer in these elections is who and how will be able to boost growth in the next 3 or 4 months. And Europe can play a very important role in that.
Just on the issues of growth, I think Paul is much better, Nobel Laureate is much better equipped to talk about this, particularly in the U.S. context. But in the European context, in the countries where we work, the emerging democracies and transition economies, you have to remember, the catch-up growth of the 1990s. So after the transition recession, you had rapid growth throughout most of those countries, which started to trail off in the 2000s. And we've now come to a point where, it's our view that what happened ultimately is that growth stabilized. For growth to continue and to continue a process of convergence, and it's not only Greece, of course, it's all the countries in Southeastern Europe and in Eastern Europe as well, for a process of convergence to achieve living standards somewhere near those of say the EU 15 countries, the initial EU members, it's going to require a lot more reform. And I think this goes back to what Anna was just saying. I mean, I think you need better policies, and that policy change has really ground to a halt. What we wrote about in our 2013 transition report is the problem of transition, which had gotten off to a very fast start, now getting stuck. And unless it gets unstuck, unless better policies are chosen, unless you have a return to reform in countries that think that they have more or less done everything they can do, it's very unlikely that they will achieve the levels of growth to produce that kind of convergence. And it is, I think Paul would agree, a political problem at the end of the day. The reason why some of those policies are not being introduced is because they're being stopped in one way or another by a political process which is sometimes sclerotic, sometimes captured by particular economic or other elites. But it's essential if we want to see those kinds of growth rates that would produce more even distribution of the benefits, that policy reform starts to happen again.
Okay, I'm going to be something of a skeptic here. The general rule is that we know a lot less than we pretend to about what promotes economic growth. And we have limited reason to believe that policy changes that will make large differences. Of course, you try to do what you can, and blatant inefficiencies and misallocations are something to fight against. But if you ask, what do we know? Greece, on the eve of the crisis, had about 60% of the productivity of Germany. Do we know what would close that gap? Do we know what would close even half that gap? The answer is really, I think, nobody knows. There would be things that would be good, but whether they would have a huge impact, we don't know. We do know a lot about macroeconomics in the short run. We do know that austerity, when it can't be offset by cutting interest rates, it does really bad things. And so I would say that I often get annoyed at people who talk about we must think about the long run and not the short run. In the long run, as John Maynard Keynes said, we are all dead. And in fact, we know short run can be enormous pain, and there's a lot we can do to alleviate that pain. And the other thing we do know how to do is to do quite a lot to distribute an economy's income more fairly. The one thing that I think is really clear from all of the academic research on inequality and growth, there's some evidence that at current levels of inequality, reducing inequality is actually favorable for growth. But I think the more important point is there's not a shred of evidence that it hurts growth. So reducing inequality is something we can do, which is an enormously good thing in and of itself, and there's no reason at all to believe that it will cripple the economy, that it will discourage the job creators, whatever it is that you're worried about. And it is, yes, it's politically hard, but, and if those who are hoping for a dramatic change in the last 7 years have been disappointed, if not horrified, to see many countries moving in the wrong direction, but it's not as if you can do nothing. And I just want, particularly I think in the US, coming back to where I know it best, there is, I think, a kind of fatalism and despair fairly often among people who are concerned about inequality, which is quite inappropriate given what has happened. In the last 2 years, 16 million people have gotten health insurance. That's a pretty, can I say it, to quote Joe Biden, when the legislation was signed, he was overheard in a stage whisper saying, "This is a big fucking deal," which it is. And tax rates. If you make $2 million a year in the U.S., you are probably paying about $100,000 a year more in taxes as a result of the tax changes that have taken place since the beginning of 2013. That's not nothing.
So fatalism and despair are not warranted. Let's see how many of you out there in the audience agree with that. We've got limited time for questions, so please put your hands up, although I also can't see you, as Serge said. Yes, this gentleman in the back here, and then this gentleman in that. And please ask a question. We have limited time for statements, so just a question, please. This gentleman first, yes. And then yourself.
Stasinopoulos, formerly with the European Commission. I think in the West, in liberal democracy, let's say countries, we talk a lot about equal opportunities as a means, as a guidance to deal with inequality of income. In the left, in communist countries, they talk about equality of outcomes. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, Paul Krugman mentioned in his initial statement about the inequality is inherited. I'm wondering whether the equal opportunities has to be modified to take into account the inequality in parents' wealth, in family wealth, which contributes substantially to maintain the inequality.
Yeah, brief answer is the notion, anyone who says, well, I don't worry about equality of outcomes, I only worry about inequality of opportunity, is closing his eyes to the reality of the world. Both just look around and ask yourself, is there really equality of opportunity? Or look at the now abundant statistical literature. The fact of the matter is, even in education, we know, to put it bluntly, rich dumb kids are more likely to get a college degree than poor smart kids. The inequality of circumstances of a highly unequal society trumps, to stop using that word, but anyway, dominates the formal equality of opportunity.
Thank you. I would like to address a question to Mr. Krugman and a comment from Mrs. Diamantopoulou. How much do you think economic wealth and economic growth is really correlated with democracy? And if I take the example of Greece, we have seen that the crisis brought as a result neo-fascist movements and radical left parties to increase their power. We see also, if we take examples from other countries in Africa or in Asia, where there is no democracy, where there is no economic wealth, they have also problems with the democratic processes. So how do you think that is correlated? Also adding the comment, if the economic inequalities at macroeconomic level play a role. Thank you very much.
Yes, a few points. First, the answer is obvious. There is such a correlation between poverty and crisis and inequality and deterioration of democratic functions. This was the case in Greece, but it was not only the rise of the neo-Nazi party. It is the way that democracy functions, the parliament, the government, the institution. It was a deterioration in all of these during the 10 years. And concerning if I can just make a point for the equal opportunities, I think that one of the major issues, and particularly during the crisis and all over the world, is the issue of equal opportunities in education, in public education, in high-level education. What Mr. Clausen said a few minutes ago was that this was the main issue, the public educational with quality system. So just to say what to do and only analysis, last year our organization initiated a movement, a European movement, Invest in Education, trying to bring in the European Parliament and in all governments the discussion to exclude part of the budget of education from the deficit and finding other sources and with cooperation with EBRD, with the EBRD to finance part of the educational needs in all countries, because of course education is part of the democratic procedure as well.
Yeah, there's a reason why anti-democratic parties have risen sharply in Europe in recent years. Do you really think that the political scene would look the way it does if the euro area unemployment rate were 7% instead of 11? Obviously, it's or whatever it is now, but it's clearly, and it's now democracies are wonderfully robust to bad patches. They have a deep reserve of legitimacy, but not infinite.
It is not, I think it's very complicated. In Denmark, there is no euro and there is no poverty, and we have the rise of extreme
although surprisingly bad economic outcomes.
Finland and in Great Britain as well.
You should take a look at Finnish GDP per capita. It's not quite what one would imagine. It's not just Southern Europe that is suffering.
We had a gentleman in the back here, and then a couple of other. Yes, sir.
Yes. A comment for the
very
previous.
Quick comment,
yes,
because we only have limited time for questions.
Very quick. Yes. A comment to the previous panel, to the venture capitalist, professor and philosopher Axelos.
What is your question for our panel?
No. I will make a comment and then the question to the panel. Said that the difference between the human being and the animal is that the human being has conscience about his death. The animal just dying. About the comment about the human beings to feed them, etc. Similar question is that why the reforms to the panel are going only against the poor in every part of the world. The reform has to change the world. Reform means a progressive idea. Reforms in every part of the world are against the poor people. Why does it happen?
Interesting point. Alan, do you want to take that?
First, I would debate the point that all reforms are against the poor, and I think as I said in my remarks earlier, we started working in countries that had completely sort of dysfunctional systems, and did create an underclass. I mean, they did create poverty in places where poverty didn't exist, and they created great wealth where that didn't exist. The policies that I talked about earlier that I think ultimately need to be the focus of European decision makers and decision makers in other countries where we're working are policies of more of inclusion, not policies that are against the poor. Our hope is that policies that create a level playing field, and I do think equality of opportunity matters a lot, that these are the essential policies that governments have to start putting in place. But part of the problem is that the early stages of transition, they created this original sin that now creates difficulties that policymakers can't easily overcome. And I think unless you start to think about ways in which you can bring the youth back into the political equation, ways that you can bring women into the political equation, and ways you can bring other excluded groups more into the political equation, you're never going to have the kind of robust support for the transition process that has to continue, because as I said before, the convergence process is far from over in any part of where EBRD works, even in the EU member states, and it needs to continue.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Yes, sir, in the back.
My question goes to Dr. Krugman, who is very popular here in Europe among certain ideological political camp. And it has to do with the counter-argument that here in Europe, contrary to America, the question is not only between rich and poor, but between insiders to the system and outsiders. We have 1/3 of society which is well protected, public servants with access to pensions, early retirements, and all sorts of benefits, and the other 2/3 which is outsiders. So the argument goes that you are blinded by your American experience. In Europe, we have the largest welfare state. We spend more than the rest of the world combined. Italy had no austerity for 30 years and no growth. So the question goes, how can we bring into the system the 2/3 of society, not the top 0.01% that you keep on talking about, versus the 1/3 of society that is well protected, inside the public, a vast public sector that is unproductive, especially in Southern Europe. So how do you adapt your American-based narrative to the Southern European realities?
Great last question for you.
Okay, so look, inefficient public sectors are not a good thing. Overpaid public sector workers are not a good thing, although I believe that if that was a problem that worried you here 5 years ago, it's a much less, let's say much less of a problem now. You have to ask, I think the main point in the current context is you have to ask, if you further reduce the privileges of the public sector, whatever it is, how exactly does that help the other 2/3? How is that going to create jobs? How is that going to create a recovery? Don't say that it's obvious, because it's not. In an economy which is crippled by austerity, where there is simply not enough demand for the workers, how is that kind of reform, whatever the virtues of it might be, if the economy were anywhere near full employment, how does that help in the current situation? So I have no brief for all of the things that made Greece inefficient. Had made Greece inefficient for decades, but you know, it was an inefficient country a long time ago, but did not have 25% unemployment. The question is, how do you deal with that now? And all this kind of discussion seems to me to be not wrong, but off point for the current crisis.
That answer sparks an entire debate in and of itself. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I would invite you to approach our panelists afterwards with questions. I'm sure you've got plenty. Thank you very much for joining us.
Liz, Paul, Anna, and Alan, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a break. Refreshments are served just outside this room. Can you please be back in 20 minutes? We are live streaming this event, so we have a lot of other people following us around the world. So we'll see you in 20 minutes. Thank you.